About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
And this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, and through this series of programs, I'm explaining some of the ideas and experiments and introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer your questions as you send them to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. While in the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is considered being awake and aware and knowing what's going on around us, in the field of noetics, as it's emerged over the past 100 years or so, consciousness is much more. It's the processes and products of mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's our profound human experiences. And ultimately, consciousness is what connects us all. So far, in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness and mind is, starting with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's ideas from the early 20th century, then into the mid-century with Charles Tart's 1960s work on states of consciousness and Julian Jaynes, who related consciousness to the separation of right and left hemispheres in our brain. And then some of the field models of the mind that have been developed by Rupert Sheldrake, Kurt Lewin, and others. Then we began to consider how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness with the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, Amit Goswami, and some others. We also looked at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, Ervin Laszlo, and a few more. Then we explored the field of transpersonal psychology, founded in the 1970s, to apply some of these newer understandings in therapy and in research. We looked at Bruce Lipton, Candace Pert, and others who described molecules of emotion and the biology of belief. And last week, we began to explore some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness with the Global Consciousness Project and its ongoing mapping of humanity's responses to major events. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Click on the little cloud up on the banner at the top of the screen. And on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention and use. Today, we're continuing to look at some of the experiments that have documented this broader understanding of consciousness. Our focus today is on the body's response to events before they have been perceived. That's right. Over 100 experiments and dozens of labs have demonstrated that when presented with randomly changing stimuli a few seconds apart, brain activity and body responses begin 1 to 3 seconds before the stimulus is even presented, much less perceived. It's called presentiment, and here's a description of some of the studies from YouTube.
Nearly all of us have experienced intuitive hunches or gut feelings about things yet to unfold. Some believe they have glimpsed the future in their dreams. Others describe a profound sense of timelessness during meditation. Do these experiences suggest that the mind extends beyond the present moment, or are they just illusions? Once again, scientists have designed experiments to find out. Throughout the 20th century, most precognition experiments invited participants to predict the outcome of a future event, like a randomly selected picture, card, or dice throw. Applying statistical analysis to the guesses, researchers looked to see if their participants had scored higher than was predicted by chance. An overview of all precognitive experiments reported between 1935 and 1987 concluded that a real effect had been observed. In recent decades, the focus of precognition research has shifted to the unconscious. One approach looks at unconscious changes in people's nervous system. If precognition exists, the nervous system might react just prior to being exposed to a sudden stimulus. In these experiments, participants are presented with a series of images, some of which are highly emotional, intended to cause a dramatic psychological response. These could be graphic images of surgery or accident scenes. Contrasting these are calmer images, featuring mundane scenes like textures on furniture. The results of these experiments, which were first carried out by Dean Radin, show that physiological arousal is indeed slightly higher just before an emotional image appears on the screen. Radin terms this mysterious sensitivity to future events presentiment. In response to these surprising findings, Professor Dick Bierman at the University of Amsterdam conducted a series of experiments using a nearly identical design. Bierman's study was also remarkably successful, producing very similar results. Since then, presentiment research has continued in a number of independent labs, and the effect has been reported in a range of biological processes, including skin conductance, heart rate, brainwaves, and pupil dilation. In a later report, Bierman also found evidence of presentiment in mainstream studies that had been originally designed to test other variables. Precognitive experiences have been reported throughout history. They remain a part of modern culture. They found their way into our language and our stories. Many of us have learned to pay close attention to feelings that point to future events. The presentiment studies offer supportive evidence that our perceptions transcend the familiar boundaries of time. Precognition could turn out to be real.
That was part of a video series called Extraordinary Abilities by Adrian David Nelson. Now, what's going on here? Clearly, perception does not trigger the response, because the response is happening before the stimulus is even presented, much less perceived. The fact that it doesn't matter whether the stimulus is an image, a sound, or a flash of light tells us that several parts of the brain are receiving the information before it is perceived. So either the brain is not dependent on the five senses to take in information, or conscious awareness works outside of time and space, or conscious awareness changes the time sequence. And all these hypotheses are being tested now. In Amsterdam, Dick Bierman is working on the idea of time reversal, building on the work of David Feynman, John Wheeler, and other physicists who established that some quantum events have been recorded before the experiment actually happened. As he puts it,
that time is running backwards there. And my hypothesis is, I have a model that it's consciousness that is necessary, a conscious experience is necessary to make the time running backwards. So I don't know anything about consciousness except that it seems to be necessary to have this reversal of cause and effect. I think that about 50% of the population will tell you stories, namely that they feel not well, they have some feeling that something is going to happen, even before they can know that something is going to happen. So many people know this already, but science has always been very reluctant to give up causality.
Truly, the idea that some material cause is necessary for a material effect is built into physics. But that idea that somehow consciousness is related to the sequence in which things happen is very much a part of the whole realm of quantum physics. I actually got to see evidence of that when I was in high school, and my neighbor worked at the accelerator at Stanford University. Now, another researcher, Daryl Bem at Cornell University, is working on the idea that consciousness works outside of time, that future events actually affect the present. He's using experiments on precognitive approaches to stimuli that might be negative or erotic, that are priming various things, and he's actually looking at how practicing a bunch of things after an experiment can improve the recall of what happened during the experiment. He's calling it retroactive facilitation of recall. Now, Bem's experiments have inspired a lot of criticism, but they've also been replicated many dozens of times and were even reported by the U.S. National Institutes of Health as worthy of further investigation. In the U.S., Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and others in other labs are working on the hypothesis that individual awareness is not limited to perceptions. And they're using all kinds of scanning techniques and variations on the experiment to discover what is really going on. You can find a nice description of that in Radin's book, Super Normal, and also in the video, Something We Don't Know What. I got to experience something like all this with a college friend who had been blinded in high school and was able to learn karate from Bruce Lee's instructor, sensing where his opponent was without seeing him. It's not unlike the master in that TV series, Kung Fu. Conscious awareness, then, may be happening long before we actually perceive something, especially when that something is emotionally loaded. And this is supported, indeed, by what we saw in that project we looked at last week, September 11 of 2001, with the Global Consciousness Project. One of the things that a number of people have observed is that the degree of randomness was beginning to shift several hours, in fact, even the day before the event happened. The global mind was picking up on something that was emotionally intense. And this makes sense, individually and collectively, from a survival point of view. A person or a community that is aware of a danger before the attack, or is aware of something wonderful, food or water, before actually seeing it, is far more likely to survive and even thrive in situations where they might otherwise not. And that brings me to the book that I want to talk about today. In the UK and elsewhere, Rupert Sheldrake and his team have done quite a few experiments around people's awareness of others that they can't see. These are documented in his book, The Sense of Being Stared At. So let's talk about this book. It came out in 2003 as a result of some of the input Sheldrake got from his request to readers for experiments that might help demonstrate his theory of morphic resonance, which was outlined in the 1980s in his book, A New Science of Life, and later. In this book, The Sense of Being Stared At, he goes far beyond presentiment to explore various aspects of precognition. I'll read to you from page 2. Telepathy, premonition, and the sense of being stared at are currently unexplained in scientific terms. Indeed, their very existence is controversial. They appear to happen. But if all possible kinds of forces, fields, and information transfer are already known to science, then they ought not to exist. Is our scientific understanding of fundamental principles already more or less complete? Have all the big questions been answered? Some scientists believe they have. On the other hand, if these phenomena do in fact occur, they show that current science is incomplete. When they are taken seriously within the scientific community, the effects will be revolutionary. They will enlarge our ideas about mind and brains, and about animal nature and human nature, and about space and time. In this book, he says, I discuss a large body of evidence and summarize recent research that shows that telepathy, the sense of being stared at, and precognition occur both in non-human animals, such as dogs and cats, and in people. They are not paranormal or supernatural. They are normal and natural, part of our biological nature. Rupert Sheldrake in his book, The Science of Being Stared At. That's at the very beginning, and then there's, of course, 300-ish pages of wonderful, wonderful descriptions. He writes very clearly, so it's an easy read. And then the appendices that detail the experiments with all the tables and the numbers and the statistics and all that good stuff, right? At the end of the book, he says, in this book, I have suggested that our minds extend beyond our brains. They do so even in the simplest act of perception. Images are where they seem to be. Subjects and objects are not radically separated, with subjects inside heads and objects in the external world. They are interlinked. Through vision, the external world is brought into the mind through the eyes, and the subjective world of experience is projected outward into the external world through fields of perception and intention. Our intentions stretch out into the world around us and also extend into the future. We are linked to our environment and to each other. It's quite a book, and if you're at all interested in the details of how such things have been tested, this is the book to read. That sound tells me that it's time to talk about something that is happening in the news today, or that you've sent me an email at ruth@noeticmoments.org asking me to talk about on the show. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of related to what we've been talking about. It's the idea that a brain transplant is a useful way for people to communicate. Now, some of you who've been following this field may be aware that some years ago there was an experiment, several experiments, very successful, in which electrodes were planted in the brains of chimpanzees and some monkeys, and they were able to manipulate various things on the computer through the transplants. Well, the research on that has continued. It's extended. It's amazing what's happening now. And as of the middle of March 2022, a wonderful new thing is happening. You may be familiar that there is an illness called ALS. It used to be called Lou Gehrig's disease, in which the body slowly deteriorates. The connections between the nerves and the muscles deteriorate to the point where the person in the body can no longer manipulate any part of the body. And for those who are stuck in the condition of not being able to hardly even move their eyes, they're called locked in patients. Can you imagine being totally conscious, totally aware and alive and interested in what's going on and not being able to communicate at all? They've trained this patient to intend to move his eyes. And the intention to move his eyes in various directions has been keyed to a keyboard and a screen so that he can choose letters on a screen and spell out what it is that he hopes to communicate. This is not too different from what the famous physicist Stephen Hawking was doing with his various technologies as his body lost its muscle control. But this is through a brain transplant. Now, it's not magic. It takes weeks and months, in fact, over a year before he could actually communicate meaningful sentences. He could get phrases out. And recently, what was in the news this last couple of weeks was he was able to say things like, "Thank you so much, sis, for all that you've done. And I love my babies, my boys, my children, and I want to watch a movie with them." Things like that, simply by intending to move his eyes and in the intention signal through these electrodes planted in the brain to make changes in a screen that gave him the letters he needed to spell out a sentence. So we're using the electrochemical capacity of the brain to affect the world around us directly through this process. It's related to what Sheldrake and these others have been saying, that there is something that's going on in the perceptual and brain process that can affect the world around us and is affected by the world around us. And it's taking us one more step closer to understanding how that works. Very exciting stuff. So if we take this experiment, this very powerful experience for everyone involved, and we look back at some of the models of mind and consciousness that we've been talking about, we can begin to see that it's possible from a materialist point of view to accomplish an awful lot using the brain and the brain functions. But we can also see the power of intention to make a difference in one's life and one's world. If the person who is a locked-in patient is unable to focus their intention, is unable to say, okay, I will that my eye would be focusing over there, and therefore that letter will appear on the screen, then nothing is going to happen. So there's a huge part of consciousness that has to do with intention. We don't really understand how that works, especially since so much of what appears to be happening in consciousness is subconscious. For example, the presentiment experiments. People's bodies are responding before the person has the awareness of what is being presented. It hasn't even been presented. So we need to understand more about the nature of consciousness here. There's something going on that is affecting the brain, and the brain then is affecting the body, but that something is not limited to the brain. As Sheldrake's work shows, there is a way in which what is going on around us that is related to what is important to us affects us. And this is what Carl Jung described when he was talking about synchronicity. He was saying something that hadn't a material cause, but clearly had a meaningful relationship with what is. And to remind you, Jung developed the term synchronicity after watching a number of people in his mental hospitals and his personal clients have experiences that were related to what they were dreaming about. And in particularly one day in his offices in Switzerland, he was talking with a client who was describing a dream in which there was this amazing South American butterfly. In which there was this amazing African scarab beetle in her dream. Now, that means a lot in certain kinds of mythologies. But as she was talking about it in Switzerland, in Jung's office, one of those very scarab beetles flew into the room. And that is the essence of synchronicity. There is some kind of causal relationship between what we are focusing on of what we are emotionally connected with and our experience. Intention is one layer of it. It's the conscious layer of it. But there are subconscious processes going on here as well. And this is the work that noetic scientists are really exploring in the world today. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll begin to look at some of the research supported by and done at the institute that Edgar Mitchell founded, that Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. It'll be more of the research around how consciousness really functions. We're out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, along with archived past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.